During my monastic years, I was involved in the project of interreligious dialogue. Along with a Benedictine sister, a Buddhist monk and a Hindu nun, I pioneered what came to be known as Australian Monastic Encounter. It was a privileged experience in which I visited a number of different monastic centres around Australia and enjoyed the hospitality of various Buddhist monks, exchanging with them the pathways in the spiritual life. In the work of interreligious dialogue, we often detect great similarities and parallels between the religious traditions. Yet we're also confronted with striking differences. Out of the desire to create a universal sense of fraternity, it has been a danger to try to pretend that the differences are not as great as they first seem. But in fact, the differences do remain. And respect for difference and otherness is vital if authentic exchange is to take place. We don't deal well with differences. One writer, David Tracy, speaks of the terror of otherness. In the face of this terror, there is a part of us that wants everything and everyone to be more of the same. We know this even in the context of our own relationships, how hard it is for us to allow our partner and other members of our family to be truly different from ourselves. We wish they could be more like us. And there is a part of us that, even unconsciously, sets out to make them more like me. Of course, the end is frustration and conflict. In letting the other be other, truly different from me, there is a great sense of freedom and a potential for growth. Indeed, it is a sign of maturity that when we can let others be not me, but be fully themselves, and especially when we can do so without anxiety or insecurity, all of us, of course, stumble and grope towards this along the way. As it is true of us personally, so, of course, is it true of us as a society. A mature society accepts diversity and difference in its midst. It's not frightened by the stranger or the foreigner. And it has the freedom and insight to look as to how to integrate such diversity into common purpose. We know that for ourselves as Australians, this kind of openness and hospitality toward the other, towards those who are different from ourselves, has not been easy for us to achieve. Although through multiculturalism we've travelled a long way in the last 40 or so years, the residue of being a much more homogenous society still lurks in our consciousness. It is easy for us to distrust what we regard as different or as foreign. Henry Newen, writing in the 1970s, described the spiritual life as a movement, though, from hostility to hospitality. As the Spirit works in our life, we are moved beyond our instinctive defensiveness towards the stranger and the foreigner, toward a new perspective, that is one of hospitality. The Spirit makes us less defensive. The Spirit opens up new possibilities for us in our encounter with the one who is different and other than ourselves. For the people of the Scriptures, the practice of hospitality was one of the ways by which they encountered God. The stranger was to be welcomed and even feted. Now, this was not simply an open door policy, because to work effectively, the practice of hospitality requires certain boundaries and limits. And yet it was a deep recognition that God comes to us and that we grow in the unexpected encounter and in the presence and word of the stranger in our midst. Entertaining the stranger with hospitality means first and foremost listening to their story, inquiring into it and allowing it to be different than my own. This is hard to do. It's much easier to classify what is different than myself and keep it, therefore, at arm's length. But when we do invite someone to tell their story, our sense of common solidarity can begin to emerge. We see them in a new light. Of course, it's not by accident that governments keep the stories of asylum seekers, for example, from the public gaze. Thus we are prevented from seeing them as persons. We can keep them classified simply as a faceless group. It's only when we encounter persons as persons that our true responsibility towards them becomes awakened. The extraordinary thing of what we are talking about here is that it occurs in Jesus' own experience as recounted in the Gospel of this Sunday. Jesus is confronted with a Canaanite woman, a stranger, a foreigner, someone culturally very different from himself. And at first he reacts as we do in such a situation, defensively, even with hostility. But her presence persists. He hears her story. His perspective changes, and this becomes a turning point in Jesus' ministry. Because from this point on, Jesus' ministry is not only concerned with a small circle of Judaism, he begins to see his ministry in categories which are now universal. And it's precisely in his encounter with someone who is different that brings him to this point in which his own sense of identity grows and expands. He experiences what the French writer Louis Massignon suggests when he wrote, "Only in exercising hospitality towards another, in sharing the same work, the same bread as honourable companions, can one understand the truth that unites us socially. One can only find truth through the practice of hospitality." Like Jesus, are we willing to risk encountering the stranger in our own life and therefore to grow towards the truth of who we are?